A very good evening to all of you. On behalf of Oxford University Press, I would like to welcome you all to a lecture on the ethics and economics of climate change policy. To begin with, I'd like to request Professor Shrikant Gupta, Associate Professor at Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi, to welcome Professor Charles Kostad and take the evening forward.
I'd like to invite first Dr.Navroz Dubash to make his comments on what Professor Kolstad has said, but also I think you also have important perspectives. So.
Thank you, Shrikant, and thank you very much, Professor Kolstad, for visiting us and sharing these thoughts. One of the great benefits of being part of the IPCC is, in fact, to interact with people like Professor Kolstad regularly and have the opportunity to learn from them. What I'm going to try and do is bring to some of these comments some of the Indian discussion around these topics, some of which may be of interest, some of which may be entirely wrong-headed, but we'll leave that to the audience and to my fellow panelists. I want to start with this issue of historical responsibility, because that really is a sort of ground zero for climate debates in India. It's almost an article of faith we have here that, and I think if we sort of break down this debate into, say, the last 20 years of discussion, that's been ongoing since about 1992. For much of that 20 years, the Indian public debate has, to caricature somewhat, has been, look, we didn't cause this problem. We need to insulate our domestic policymaking process from having to react in any way, shape, or form to the problem. And the bedrock of that common position has been this argument about historical responsibility. I'll come in a minute to how I think that has now changed a little bit, but historical responsibility continues to be key. And the nub of the argument is as follows. It is the historical responsibility argument that Professor Kolstad mentioned, but the kinds of nuances that he brought about, that he introduced, are addressed in the following way. So one of the points that is often made, as Professor Kostad mentioned, is, look, if you don't have prior knowledge of the consequences of your action, you can't be held responsible for this. And that is, in fact, a powerful argument. The response, though, is that in legal terms, most legal arguments, in fact, make that point, but there are a few key exceptions. So in India, we often throw back the example of the US PURPA Act, and I can't remember exactly what PURPA stands for, but basically in public, is it PURPA or no? It's not PURPA. It's the leaking underground. Superfund. It's the Superfund stuff. Sorry, it's Superfund, not PURPA. Yeah, which basically says, look, even if you didn't have knowledge of underground, say, toxic waste leakage, you are nonetheless responsible for cleaning that up. So that's an example that's often used by Indian activists and NGOs to say, look, even in the US, not having knowledge isn't an adequate defense against taking responsibility. There's another argument which basically says, if you have a harmful action that occurred in the past, you only have two choices: those who benefited from that action taking responsibility, or those who didn't benefit from that action taking responsibility. So asking India to take on responsibility for this basically says, even though you didn't benefit from that action, whereas in the West, those who did emit actually have the benefit from all the accumulated infrastructure, it's surely more fair that those who did benefit should take more responsibility, even if they were unaware. That's sort of the argument in the Indian context in response to this. And there are other things. The identity problem, the response is, look, the identity problem the non-identity problem can somehow be fudged by saying you have this endowment of infrastructure that passes from generation to generation, which allows you to sidestep that non-identity problem, and so on. These are issues to be solved by ethicists, but just to make the point that this debate has continued, and there have been sort of these nuances, and I want to sort of share some of the points that those who've been active in it from the Indian side have made. But I want to sort of go beyond the historical responsibility discussion to make a couple more points. One is that, again, as Professor Kostad mentioned, India is in this very strange position. We don't have a lot of historical emissions. If you look at India's historical emissions, it's not a big share of the total. but we are a very substantial share of absolute emissions. We are now the third largest emitter in the world. And we will likely be a large share of future emissions. And so there's this sort of pragmatic point of view that says, look, down the road, whether we pay for it or somebody else pays for it, a lot of the cuts or a lot of the reductions from what would otherwise have been, not cuts from where we are, but cuts from where we might have been from a hypothetical baseline, surely have to come from China, India, and other countries. And in this sense, we have, we are what Ambassador Shamsar, our former negotiator, used to call a premature power, in the sense that we have this huge future emissions. We have a large global footprint, but we are also an incredibly poor country. So there's another part to this responsibility story, which is capability. In fact, that key catchphrase in the UNFCCC is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, CBDRRC. If you ever get into this, that's the acronym of ART. So India is in a very sort of complicated position with respect to this. We don't have much historical responsibility. We have very weak capability, but we do have a very large emission footprint. So in the domestic debate, people try to pass this issue in the following way. And this is now a gradual shift within India from saying only we do not have responsibility for what occurred in the past. There's a distinction now drawn between responsibility for, which is in a sense culpability, and responsibility to, which is in a sense duty. And you could pass that by saying, look, the fact, in the same way that we argue that ignorance of effect in the past is no excuse for inaction, by that same token, our knowledge about the consequences for our actions in the future confers some responsibility on us. That is responsibility to act. So we say we don't have responsibility for the past, but we do have a responsibility to the future. So what forms of actions should we take that are consistent with this passing of responsibility? Acceptance of responsibility to act, and denial of responsibility for past actions. And I just want to introduce, in the couple of minutes I have left, one way in which some of us have tried to argue for how India can in fact pass sort of walk this fine line. And it is actually by introducing a term which is very central in the chapter that Professor Kostad's involved in, which is a term that many of you may have come across, and if you follow this debate, you will undoubtedly come across, and that is the term co-benefits. So what India is increasingly being arguing is we should modify what we do in terms of our development, but we should modify it in a way that doesn't constrain our development futures. And the way in which we do that is by exploring co-benefits, actions that yield climate gains at the same time as they yield development gains. So that is one way in which India can actually play an active role and step forward in the international global process, accepting a form of responsibility to act without accepting responsibility for historical emissions. Now, that sounds a little too easy, and it is, because the concept of co-benefits is a complicated concept. We can discuss it further if you like in the question and answer. This chapter actually does a very nice job discussing the nuances of co-benefits-based actions. It will be a very big theme in the forthcoming IPCC report. I hope I'm not giving away any secrets here, but I think it will be an important theme. The question becomes, however, that if India says, look, we will take on co-benefits actions, if other countries, notably those who we argue should have responsibility for emissions as well, if those countries also say, look, we also will take on co-benefits-based actions, then we are left with a world where nobody accepts absolute limits. India's argument is, we will take on co-benefits actions, but not absolute limits. But for that to work, some countries do have to take on absolute limits. So one possible formulation of a global cooperation is countries that have contributed most in the past take on absolute limits. They have to absolutely limit what they do and start reducing. Other countries that haven't contributed to past emissions take on co-benefits measures where they deviate from their business as usual baseline, and they do that in credible ways, not just in ways that are sort of hand-waving and that say, look, we're doing the best we can. There has to be some way of benchmarking what they do. So the debate is sort of poised in this way. Now this is stepping entirely outside my IPCC role as somebody who tries to be a participant in the debate. I think the important question for India going forward is, how can we make credible our claim to be doing co-benefits? Right now, we're waving our hands. We have to find some more credible way of convincing the world that our co-benefits actions are a serious contribution and that we are seriously rethinking our development trajectories. And that's sort of the intellectual challenge that I think we face here in India. And there's a second challenge, which is communicating this approach to the rest of the world in a way that is convincing.